Well, hi everyone. So this is our last session of the day, apart from maybe a quick roundup that we'll do at the very end. So Bratislav is just coming on the screen to introduce Rick, and I will disappear myself and let him go ahead.
Hello and welcome everyone to the last session here. We're really fortunate to have Dr. Richard Betzel from Indiana University giving this keynote address. Rick is really an authority on everything network neuroscience, and he's done fantastic work from everything spanning from the mesoscale organization of the brain, network communication, structure-function relationships, network development over the lifespan, control theory. These are just things that I'm coming up with on the fly. But his work has been really varied and very foundational to our field. He's going to talk to us today about an exciting new direction that his group has opened up on edge-centric connectomics. Thank you so much, Rick, for joining us. Sorry for the delays. This is kind of a trickle-down effect, but we really appreciate it and looking forward to it.
I appreciate the introduction, and we all know trickle-down doesn't really work, right? So bad joke. So yeah, today I want to talk a little bit about edge-centric connectomics. And this is a point that I'm sure everybody is aware of, but I'll cover it because it's in my slides. My work deals with network neuroscience. And this generally involves transforming either tractography data or recorded activity into networks. This is done by parcellating our brain into units, regions of interest, asking, are there tracts between two regions? Are the activity of those two regions correlated? If so, we draw lines between those two regions, indicating the connectivity between them. The regions become nodes, the lines become edges, and that gives us networks or graphs. We represent these as matrices, as a sparse structural connectivity matrix, or for instance, a fully weighted correlation matrix in the case of functional connectivity. And we can then probe these matrices using tools from network science and graph theory to better understand their structure and function, from simple measures like the capacity for influence, a node's degree, just the number of connections it makes, to the extent that information is segregated in the network, its modular structure, and what there are presences of hubs in the network that span modules, as well as how information goes from one point in the network to another, how it is integrated across the brain. My lab as Bratislav alluded to, has worked in this space and done lots of different work. There's some themes that run throughout it. So this is a graph of all of our papers as of like a year ago, linked based on common occurrences of words. So our work has dealt with structure-function relationships, the notion and also the methods used to detect modularity in networks, the effect of wiring cost on constraining brain network structure, and how networks change over fast timescales, so-called time-varying functional connectivity. But today, I want to tell you about a new direction, or at least new as of 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, that our lab, along with some close collaborators, have started working on, that we term edge-centric connectomics. And this graph, I said, is outdated. There should be a few more nodes here, but you can see that this new arm of research really moves off of our beaten path, although you'll see that many of these themes still work their way into this new direction. So to tell you and better understand edge-centric connectomics, we need to take a look back at the node-centric, the more traditional version. So again, this is nothing new, but every brain network, oh shoot, sorry, I just lost my slides. Every brain network is composed of two elements, right? It's nodes or vertices. Those are brain regions, brain areas, sensors, etc. And its edges, the interrelationships between those units. And historically, network neuroscience, the field in which I work, has been mostly interested in nodes and how they interact with one another. This is, again, making measurements of how influential a node is, how many connections it makes, what community a node belongs to, how central a node is with respect to a particular process. And this really parallels a history in neuroscience and neuroimaging of parceling, mapping, and labeling brain areas, going back at least to Brodmann building cytoarchitectural maps of the brain, to more recent imaging-based efforts to parcelate and label the brain on the basis of anatomical structure or its functional organization. So those are examples of node prioritization in network neuroscience, but there have been other scientific domains that have prioritized edges over nodes. I'll give you two examples, both coming from network science proper. So one good example is an approach known as link similarity. This comes from a YY An and Lajla Barabashi. It's an older paper now. But what link similarity effectively does is it shifts perspective onto a network's edges. And it does this by considering pairs of edges. They must share a stub node, so they have one node in common, which leaves two unpaired stubs. And then you look for, of those stub nodes, how much do their connectivity profiles overlap? This gives us a way of relating two edges to one another. In this case, there's a Jacquard index, and the overlap of edge 1 and edge 2 of their unpaired stubs is 1/3. There's 3 edges that are not accounted for, and they overlap with 1. We can do this for every pair of edges, building up an edge-edge connectivity matrix. So it's a little bit different than what we're traditionally used to seeing in network neuroscience. The elements in this represent edges as opposed to the nodes. There's an advantage of studying these edge-edge matrices. We can apply any kind of network analysis to them. After all, they're an adjacency matrix. But one of the, I would argue, most useful things that we can do with them is study the community structure of edges. And I'll talk a lot more about this later. But the advantage is that we are now labeling the communities of edges, not of nodes, which gives us the ability to affiliate an individual node with multiple communities. For example, this node here, it's partially affiliated to a blue edge community, a green edge community, and a red edge community, something that's not typically done in network neuroscience. Other approaches for prioritizing edges include something called line graphs. So we build an incidence matrix where every edge is listed and the 2 nodes that are involved in that edge have an entry of 1. And then we can take the outer product of this matrix with itself, and it gives us another edge-edge matrix. It has some similarities to the line or to the link similarity method. And again, you can apply network science and network analysis to both of these matrices equally well to learn something about the edge-edge structure of these networks. Both of these methods can be viewed as a transformation of node-level data into edge-level data. And the goal that we initially set out to achieve was to do something similar with brain connectivity data. But there's some problems. First, these 2 methods are really only suitable for sparse matrices, networks where most of the connections don't exist. These methods also cannot deal with signed data very easily, when the connection weights are positive or negative, which is really common with functional connectivity, for instance, where we get anti-correlations in some cases. These methods also operate on the graphs themselves, the connectivity matrices themselves, and not time series, which is something that, because we're interested in dynamics, we want access to. So for a lot of reasons, link similarity and line graphs don't really work for us. So in 2019 or so, that summer, we sat down and we asked ourselves, what would an edge-centric approach for neuroimaging or brain network data look like? And we brought together a lot of people to address this question, including Farnaz Zamani-Asfalani, who was a postdoc in my lab and still is, and Young-Hun Jo, who was at the time, first-year graduate student, along with a long list of other collaborators who provided data and insight. And so in our effort to build a brain and neuroscience version of edge-centric networks, we started with our traditional functional connectivity. That was our starting point. Right, so functional connectivity, again, measures the similarity, linear similarity between recorded activity from 2 parts in the brain. It gives us a correlation coefficient typically, and we express that as a connection weight in a functional connectivity matrix. Do this for all pairs of regions, and you get your network back. But let's unpack this step just a little bit. Right, so what is a correlation actually? I'm not trying to insult anybody's intelligence. We all know what a correlation is, but I want to look at the details that go into calculating the correlation. It really proceeds through 4 steps, right? So we have our 2 time series, in this case, from 2 different parts of the brain. The first step in calculating a correlation, standardize. Z-score every instant in time and get a Z-score to time series. Then multiply each time in one time series with the same time in another. Repeat this for all frames, and then do a summation and averaging. And that gives you exactly a Pearson correlation coefficient. It gives you functional connectivity. But what if we omit this last step? What if we just don't do a summation? Well, we definitely lose the correlation then. We don't have a correlation any longer. In its place, we get back something that we call a cofluctuation time series or an edge time series. And it tells us something about how the instantaneous cofluctuations between two time series evolve. Right, so this time series, this cofluctuation or edge time series, tells us when the activity of those two regions deflect from their mean and in what direction and by how much. So I'll give you some examples. Here's a time point where the cofluctuation time series is reasonably large and positive. What that tells us, if we go look back at the red and blue time series, is that at that instant, they're both below their mean, they're deflecting in the same direction, and they're deflecting by a pretty large amount in both cases. So it shows up as a positive cofluctuation. This instant, it's big and negative. Why? Well, because one time series is going way above its mean, and the other is going way below. So that gives us a negative entry in the cofluctuation time series. We get one of these cofluctuation time series for every pair of brain regions, and everything else in this talk is going to be built on these entities. I'm going to claim that they have interesting, from just a theoretical perspective, properties, but also useful from a neuroscientific perspective. Okay, so let's say we do this procedure of generating edge time series, cofluctuation time series. Let's say we do it for all pairs of brain regions. This gives us a matrix like this. So across time, every row here is one of our cofluctuation time series. It's telling us how the coactivity between two regions changes over time. It's one edge in a network. We can also slice our matrix vertically. This is where things get a little bit interesting. If we slice at any instant in time, what we're getting back are the instantaneous patterns of cofluctuation between all edges, between all pairs of brain regions. These are instantaneous networks. These are the weights of connections instantaneously between every pair of brain regions. So we are resolving something akin to time-varying functional connectivity without the need of a sliding window, and at a frame-wise resolution. There's some caveats to this, and we can talk about those at the end, but it is giving us a moment-by-moment blow of the changes in network architecture, functional network architecture. What other properties do edge time series have? Well, if I were to just average this whole matrix across time, it gives me one entry per edge, and that's its correlation coefficient. We rearrange those and we get back the functional connectivity matrix exactly. No ambiguity. That is, this is a perfect, mathematically exact temporal decomposition of your functional connectivity matrix, which is going to allow us to do lots of interesting things that I'll show you in a couple slides. And again, it's providing us frame-wise estimates of coactivity of the networks. So once we knew this, what was our next step? Well, we have this expression for how functional connectivity relates to the edge time series. And we noticed that some frames, some time points, have really big entries in their edge time series, big deflection at particular points in time. And we asked ourselves the following question. Are these big deflections, these high amplitude excursions occurring simultaneously across all edges, or are they kind of scattered about randomly? Right? So in other words, are we seeing cohesive network level events, synchronous high amplitude activity, or is it a little more scattered? That was the question we asked ourselves. And to address that, we can actually, just on visual inspection, get some insight here. Here's our edge time series matrix again. Just looking at it, you might notice some vertical striations. I'll highlight a couple here, just big vertical bars. Those are instants in time when many edges, many node pairs express high amplitude cofluctuations all roughly the same time. If we were to take the root mean square or root sum square of the edge time series across all regions, we get a single time series that indexes the amplitude of the network, something like this. The distribution of these values are heavy-tailed, so there's a very small number of high amplitude frames, suggesting the presence of events, short, brief, intermittent, high amplitude network level activity. And to illustrate what these might look like, I'll give you an example of just a few of those high amplitude co-fluctuation patterns. So these are the patterns of connectivity expressed during those events. And here are the patterns of activity expressed during some of the troughs. So big fluctuation. The high amplitude patterns are dense, strong co-fluctuations, and at these low points, there's very little happening. These results suggest that network dynamics are fundamentally bursty, right? They're punctuated by periods of quietude or punctuated by these events. I'll point out, though, of course, that we're not the first to make claims like this, that network activity or brain activity is sparse. But I will claim that our approach is an exact decomposition of functional connectivity. It is parameter-free, so we don't have to specify a region of interest. We don't have to specify a threshold for what constitutes an event. And it is operating on the whole brain level, so not on any particular region of interest or seed, advantage over methods like CAPS or ICAPS, if you're familiar with those. Well, what do events tell us about how networks work, about their organization and dynamics? The answer to that question, I think, becomes really clear when we look at the tails of the event distribution. So this is the mean coactivity from just the top 5% of frames, and that's shown on the left, and on the right is the mean coactivity from just the bottom 5%. What you might notice is on the left, all of the connections are brighter, they're strong, the reds are redder, the blues are bluer. The connections are really strong. On the right, they're a little subdued and not much is happening. And in fact, if you examine the pattern on the left, it is strongly correlated with time-averaged functional connectivity, whereas the pattern on the right is correlated, but much less so. So this suggests that these high-amplitude events are contributing disproportionately to shaping the time-averaged functional connectivity. The same thing is true of the brain system level or modular structure. If we calculate the modularity of the high amplitude frames versus the low, the high amplitude frames tend to be much more modular and express systems, whereas the pattern on the right does not. So what this is telling us is that with just a very small number of frames, 5%, possibly even less, we can do a very good job of approximating time-averaged functional connectivity and its modules. This holds not just for the 5% that I'm showing you here, but literally over the entire range. If we examine from top to bottom and bottom to top frames in the highest and lowest amplitudes, we see there's always a big separation. So the high amplitude frames are always more similar to time-averaged functional connectivity. And it suggests, again, that the emergence of brain systems driven by network-wide high-amplitude co-fluctuations. And this might prompt you to ask then, well, what other properties do high-amplitude frames have? So in this paper, we investigated those a little bit further. We found that in this paper, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but at least in this paper, we found that events are underpinned by a single mode of brain activity. We didn't look at the second or third modes, by the way. We just kind of pulled everything together, and we found that there was a single mode that seemed to explain a single mode of activity occurring during events, and it's one that emphasizes heteromodal systems like default mode and control networks, and oppositional activation of dorsal attention, somatomotor, and visual networks. We also found that the events synchronized during movie watching. This is an important point. So they're in some way driven by exogenous stimuli. In other words, they are not reflecting spontaneous activity in the brain. This is an important point. We also showed that events, the patterns of connectivity expressed during events, lead to enhanced identifiability of individuals and also strengthen, what are quite modest, but they nonetheless strengthen brain behavior correlations. So to do this, we extracted patterns of coactivity from the high amplitude frames and low amplitude frames using the data from the Midnight Scan Club. We do this for all subjects and all of their scans, which gives us a set of high amplitude networks for subjects and a set of low amplitude networks. And we calculate for each of these sets separately an identifiability matrix, so the pairwise similarity of networks from different individuals. With the high amplitude frames, we find that There's a modest but a significant amount of identifiability. So subjects tend to be more similar to themselves than they are to other individuals. But this is not true for the low amplitude frames. So this leads us to make the claim that high amplitude frames are likely driving identifiability. We also showed using HCP data that when we examined brain behavior correlations using those same high and low amplitude networks, the high amplitude networks always lead to stronger correlations overall. This is true across the first 10 principal components of the behavioral data from the HCP data set. So we also started asking questions, and in a separate study, this is under review now, but you can find it on the bioRxiv. Are events individualized? To what extent are the event patterns individualized, and are there more than one pattern? So again, we turn to the Midnight Scan Club data set. We calculate edge time series from every individual. We extract these peak co-activation, these peak co-fluctuation patterns, and then cluster them. Interestingly enough, we find evidence for 3 clusters that are shared across individuals. I'm showing you the coactivity during each of those clusters and the projection of that activity, the coactivity onto the cortex. And then we asked, well, can we use these data to predict individuals' functional connectivity? Right? We've made claims now that events drive functional connectivity, but can we use these clusters to do that? And do our predictions require that the clusters be estimated at an individualized level? This is going to tell us something about the dynamic origins of functional connectivity. So our procedure for doing this involved, say we want to predict scan 2 from an individual in the Midnight Scan Club. We would take their matrix and we would literally calculate how often they're in each of the 3 clusters. How much time do they spend in cluster 1, 2, and 3? Weight those matrices based on that time and use that to make a prediction. Eminently simple model. And we did this using 5 different estimates of the clusters. The first, where we use all of the data, including the scan we want to predict, which isn't quite right. We do the same thing again using all of the data except the scan we want to predict. We do it again using only that subject's data, including the scan, only that subject's data excluding that scan, and then as kind of like a throwaway, we test another subject and try to use that to predict the different subjects' functional connectivity. And what we find is that when we use data from another subject, we explain about 25% of the variance. So we get clusters from a different subject. There's some correspondence, but it tends to be small. If we look at group data, that improves irrespective of whether we include that scan. It's about the same. But when we start using data from that subject, even if we exclude the scan that we're trying to predict, we actually get a very good explanation of an individual's functional connectivity. So in other words, a subject's functional connectivity is driven by individualized events. That's the conclusion that we want to draw here. Throughout this, we've kind of assumed that events are real things, but we haven't bothered to ask kind of what are the ingredients that allow events to emerge? What are the requisite ingredients for a network to exhibit events? To address this, and this is a paper that just came out yesterday in bioRxiv, we turned to simulation studies. So we used oscillator models constrained by an underlying structural network to simulate fMRI data, calculate its events, and this allows us to probe in silico the effect of that underlying structural connectivity and other ingredients on the events. So this is briefly what our pipeline looked like. It involved taking structural connectivity data to constrain a Kuramoto oscillator. When you simulate data from this, you get phase time series for each brain region, which we convolved with a hemodynamic response to generate synthetic bold data. From those, we calculated synthetic edge time series and subjected those to an event analysis where we tried to detect events in the data. If you look at the edge time series and the overall amplitude, it's more or less indistinguishable from the empirical data. It's very difficult to tell the difference. The point I'll make here, however, is that in this case there is no artifact. Right? There's no respiration. There's no in-scanner movement. There's no heart rate. This is free of artifacts, but it's also free of cognition. There is no, the model isn't receiving inputs, it's not acting, there's no neuromodulatory system that is acting on it. So it also suggests that those are not requisite ingredients to have events. But nonetheless, we looked at those event patterns and clustered them. And here are those event centroids, just like we did before. And imposed on those event centroids are structural connectivity modules. And I hope what you'll see here is that the patterns of coactivity that are expressed during events bear a strong resemblance to the underlying structural connectivity. In fact, they're truly driven by the modules. And we can say driven in this case because we destroyed the modular structure in the network, re-simulated the model, and we find that in the absence of modules, the number of events drops effectively to 0. So this suggests that event structure emerges spontaneously as a result of structure-function coupling. Basically, the structure of the underlying anatomical network shapes brain activity into such that it exhibits events. So really quickly to put this together, co-fluctuation time series provide an exact decomposition of functional connectivity. They reveal bursty network dynamics and events. Those events seem to drive functional connectivity and its modules, and seems particularly useful for studying individualized brain behavior relationships. So in the last few minutes, I'll talk about a second direction. And this is a separate paper. Now, it actually came out the same week as the PNAS paper. But we asked ourselves, well, what else can we do with these co-fluctuation time series? We know they're related to functional connectivity. We know all these things about events, but what else are they good for? Well, we thought about this a little bit, and this is returning to our original question of how can we build edge networks for imaging data, from imaging data. And what we did is we took those edge time series and calculated for every pair of edge time series their similarity. This is essentially a cosine similarity. But you'll notice that this resulting matrix, which we call edge functional connectivity, it has very different dimensions than functional connectivity, right? So if we have 200 brain regions, our edge functional connectivity has almost 20,000 rows and columns. So it's a much higher dimensional entity than traditional functional connectivity. What is a network science talk without doing at least one embedding? Here's an embedding of the edge functional connectivity. And I'll make this point again. I don't mean to belabor it, but it's sometimes confusing. In this case, the vertices of an edge functional connectivity network, they're not brain regions, rather they are pairs of brain regions. They are the edges in the network. These edges, sort of the semantics matters a little bit, but the edges are connected to one another based on the similarity of their co-fluctuation time series. So nodes in edge connectivity are edges in traditional connectivity. They are linked to one another on the basis of the similarity of their edge time series. So in the paper, we do all kinds of fun things. We show, again, using Midnight Scan Club data, that edge functional connectivity is repeatable and individualized, provided you have enough data. Interestingly, it exhibits slightly stronger fingerprints than nodal functional connectivity. This is a paper that will hopefully be out soon. We show that it is subtly but systematically modulated with input. So we compared rest and movie watching and found that they are dissociable from one another. And you can also, if you're so inclined, perform graph analysis on the edge networks, right? You can calculate every edge's degree, every edge's participation coefficient with respect to some modules, every edge's signed or weighted strength. And importantly, again, these measures are defined at the level of edges rather than nodes. In the paper, we also do brain behavior correlations, and because our reviewers were very astute, they asked us to run a bunch of benchmarks to rule out potential confounds. So there's a lot going on in the paper, but I think arguably the most useful finding concerns how edge connectivity impacts our understanding of system-level architecture. So I imagine there's lots of people on this call right now from the cogneural world, and if you're in that world, you know this image. I could come up to you on the street and ask you about the YAO systems, and you would know exactly what I'm talking about. These are enshrined labels in the cogneural and neuroimaging world. It's a parcellation or a partition functional connectivity data into 7 or 17 systems, depending on who you talk to. And those systems all have special names, right? We've given them names based on the functions that we think that they subtend. This purple blob is in visual cortex, and we think it has something to do with visual function. There's a limbic network, default mode, dorsal attention, somatomotor control, salience, ventral attention. Other people have found very similar systems. If you don't like Thomas's or the John Power version, maybe you like Evan Gordon's or the Yale group's version of this. There's lots of ways of chopping up the brain into systems. But you'll notice that all of these system labels, all of these clusters, have one feature in common, right? All of these labels are non-overlapping. That is, every parcel, every voxel, every surface gray ordinate is assigned to one and one system only. And partially, this is a methodological convenience. It's something that people adopt because it's easier to do, frankly. But it also disagrees with what we know about the brain. There are many instances where the same region responds to dissimilar stimuli or reported as being active under different conditions. So assigning it a single unitary label is probably misguided, although it's convenient. But this is where edge functional connectivity can kind of rescue us a little bit, right? So if we cluster edge functional connectivity matrices, what we're doing is we're chopping up edges into their own clusters, right? So here are the edge time series clustered into 10. So this is an example from the paper. It's an arbitrary number. But you can see when we look at the edge functional connectivity matrix, the clusters are internally relatively homogeneous and externally anti-correlated or less strongly correlated. They're highly repeatable. And to revisit this figure, it allows us to assess overlap at the level of nodes. So it allows us to assign a node to multiple communities simultaneously based on the edges, its edges cluster labels. Right. So this is this no overlap version. This is the traditional Cogneuro, Yao power labels. Some studies have relaxed this a little bit, so that just a couple nodes can have multiple labels. Our study is going to adopt a perspective known as pervasive overlap, where fundamentally every part of the brain is associated with multiple clusters at the same time. Just to give you a sense of what this looks like, here is a node-by-node matrix where every edge is labeled according to the edge cluster to which it was assigned. These are some examples of the internal edge time series for each cluster. And you can see that they tend to be very homogeneous. Here is a cluster that involves edges incident on the somatomotor network. They all move cohesively. Here's another one that involves the visual network and little bits of interactions between dorsal attention. Another one that involves default mode in the limbic network. But again, we're assigning these clusters at the level of edges. We can take these edge labels and make a projection onto the cortical surface, so we have a value of how affiliated each node is with a particular edge cluster, literally just averaging across the rows of this matrix. So here for cluster 2, I find that it's the nodes that participate in the cyan cluster, well, they tend to be those somatomotor regions. But it also includes, it's a graded inclusion, right? It includes bits, it's not as if every node belongs fully to this cluster, but it has a little bit. Here's another example of community 3 now, where there's a strong resemblance to a partial default mode, maybe a little bit of a control network, but it also gets a little bit of a contribution from edges in the somatomotor network as well. So it's giving us these overlapping profiles. We can ask then which regions have the highest levels of overlap, and the red and blue circles are hopefully hinting at that already. The highest levels of overlap, somewhat surprisingly, tend to fall in primary sensory systems and attentional networks. Somatomotor network and visual network are among the highest. The same is true for dorsal attention and the salience ventral attention networks. Now, when we saw this was a little bit confusing. If you look at literally every other study, especially every other nodal functional connectivity study, it points to systems like the control network, the dorsal attention network, salience, default mode, as all having very high levels of overlap. And overlap is usually assessed in this case using statistics like the participation coefficient. So John Power found that. Max Bertolero found that. Thomas Yao found this result. These are some big names in the network neuroscience literature. So why are we finding something different than what they're reporting? In other words, where did that overlap go? Where did the polyfunctionality in control networks go to? So to address this question, we considered edge community profiles now from the perspective of each node. So every node can be viewed as having like a fingerprint of each of its edges and their system labels. Their edge community labels. So you have a fingerprint for one region. It's a little bit different than the fingerprint or profile for a different region. And we can just compare the two. How similar are those two fingerprints? And it gives rise to a matrix that looks something like this. And you group those by systems. Hopefully you see already that the somatomotor and visual networks are incredibly homogeneous internally. So the nodes that comprise those systems have very similar edge community profiles. And in fact, in contrast, the control networks have among the lowest. So what this is telling us is that the nodes and the brain regions that make up control networks, that make up some of these default node networks, their edge community profiles are all very, very different from one another. In contrast, the primary sensory systems tend to have extremely homogeneous, almost approaching a value of 1, which is the highest level of similarity that we can measure, incredibly homogeneous edge cluster profiles. So where did the functional diversity in control networks go to? Well, it becomes a system level property from when we take this edge centric perspective. So to wrap up really quickly, this is the interim summary. Let's build on that. We proposed a measure called Edge Functional Connectivity, EFC, that tells us how similar co-fluctuation time series are to one another. We can cluster these time series to obtain cohesively co-fluctuating edges. The edge communities themselves are naturally, pervasively, and fundamentally overlapping. And we find marked heterogeneity across canonical brain systems and an inexact alignment of the two. So with that, I want to acknowledge everybody involved. And here is again, needs to be updated, but a current list of preprints using this approach. There's a long list of collaborators, people from my lab, people from Olaf's lab, the hosts of this conference. I should add, if you found this compelling, get in touch with me. We have a position to work on exactly this type of research. It's open for the next 2.5 years. We haven't filled it yet. Fully funded as a postdoc. And if you're also interested in this, we have a GitHub repository, a series of repositories for implementing these analyses. And with that, I'll stop and turn this over to the host.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rick. That was extremely exciting and compelling. For those of you that did stay a little bit longer, I think it was clearly worth it. And I'm sure that you're happy with your decision.
So I'll just chip in, Bratislav, and I concur. Like, great talk, Rick. And just kind of for people in terms of the coming to the edge of the conference now, we're going to take Bratislav's Q&A with Rick to finish up this session, and then we're going to move over to Scott for a concluding remarks. So that's our plan, and that should take us up to roughly 5:30, I think, and we'll be done.
Okay, sounds good. So we have some questions in the question box. So the first is from Matteo. How much can the co-fluctuations be influenced by differences in blood flow between different regions? Have you done any comparisons with calibrated fMRI or ASM?
No, we haven't. This is a good question. I'll say that in the empirical data, we haven't tested this, but I think this is where I think the simulations can inform us a little bit. We find events even in the absence of physiological noise, which is not present in those Kuramoto models. So we will find events. You'll find that those short punctuated high amplitude instances in simulated data where there is no risk of these kinds of, I guess you could view them as artifacts, but really physiology. So there is no physiology there. They still show up. But I think assessing its contribution to empirical data is still an open question.
Great. We have a question from Coyote. Could a positive value of edge time series indicate a quote unquote open communication channel between two nodes? So for instance, would it be possible to use the edge time series to track the spread of activity in an edge-to-edge sequential manner?
I think that's exactly the kinds of questions we're asking now. You'll notice that my work and the work of a lot of my collaborators have dealt with structure-function relationships, but those are largely absent here. So you're bumping up against work that is being planned. And I think what you're suggesting would be a reasonable approach for relating edge time series and events back to structure. There's probably more than one useful way to do this, though. I don't know that it necessarily corresponds to an open communication channel per se. So there's probably lots of factors that can give rise to events, including spontaneous co-fluctuations, in the absence of anything physiological. But I think that's an important question. We're working on that right now.
Great. Now the CCNS account, who I assume is Milad right now, asks, do you have any thoughts on how this work is connected to similar methodology from EEG that's used instantaneous Hilbert phases to detect synchronization clusters, such as the work of Williams and Breakspear?
Yeah, so there's really beautiful work, not only what you're referring to, but also there's also some instantaneous phase work. More recently, the author's name is escaping me. I'm really sorry. I think they're methodologically very closely related in the sense they're giving us instantaneous coupling patterns. You'll hear my baby crying in the background. It's a bad time of day. I don't know the details of that work, to be honest, but I know there's work in parallel looking at EEG. In fact, some of it's being applied to fMRI data to examine instantaneous phase. I suspect they probably get at similar relationships and generate similar constructs, but probably, or at least hopefully, provide different insight. So that's a boring answer. I'm sorry, but I don't have a deep insight there.
And I apologize, that was actually a question by John, not by Milan. So we have a question from Syed. Could you explain more about what the Midnight Scan Club data set is and why you used it so frequently in this work?
Oh boy, I am not the person who should be selling the Midnight Scan Club. It's already very well sold by the WashU group, including Nico and all of their acolytes. But I can tell you briefly what it is. It is 10 individuals, all scanned 10 times. And the scans are 30 minutes long each. So you have, as opposed to something like HCP, which gives you what we call shallow data, lots of subjects, but limited amounts of data. MSC gives you fewer subjects, but lots of information about them. So it's very useful for identifying features of networks that are intrinsically related to an individual. It allows you to study what is shared across individuals and what is kind of individualized. And that's the extent to which we use it. If you fail to discover similar properties within the same individual across scans, then that's for us at least, that was a red flag when we were using and building edge functional connectivity. We wanted something that was reliable within an individual, and MSC is well suited for addressing that kind of question.
And the last question is by Julia. Have you thought about making the edge FC measure more dynamic in nature, given that you're removing the averaging step? And she gives an example there. I don't know if you can see the question, Rick. There's so for instance, relating rather than relating time point X of region A with time point X of region B. What if you related signal changes between time point X and X+1 in region A to the same in region B?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the exciting things about edge connectivity and edge time series, and that anything you can do to a correlation, you can do to these edge time series. You can lag them, you can partial out shared effects, you can, you can anything that you do with a traditional time series and correlation, you can do with these. We haven't explored all of these alternatives. We, like good cogneuro people, we hint at them in our discussions. But right now, the space of things that we want to try is too big, so we've prioritized other analyses. But this is something that I think would be really fruitful and interesting.
Great. Okay. Well, sorry. There was a question from John that I skipped. I'm really sorry. What is your take on negative correlations in fMRI?
Negative correlations, I like them because I do global signal regression. Again, a bad answer, but I'm not scared by them. I don't know, again, whether they are real or not. I know that the processing steps that tend to yield negative correlations or enhance them are useful for lots of reasons, but it involves stripping away lots of physiologically relevant data, things that are correlated with arousal and probably contain meaningful signal. I tend to think in terms of data. So for me, not having it doesn't really bother me, or rather, in other words, not having global signal, like regressing it out doesn't really bother me because the data tends to do reasonably well for making predictions. It's highly individualized. I'm not afraid of them, if that was kind of the question.
I can elaborate a little bit. I mean, like, I am afraid of them in the sense that I'm interested in them, and I think it's like, so from a modeling point of view and like a brain theory point of view, like if there really are these negative correlations in brain networks, I think I find that kind of an interesting phenomenon at the time scale that they manifest, given the time scale of the intrinsic dynamics, which is like orders of magnitude faster. Like, it's not obvious how you get emergence of really profound negative correlations with that difference in timescales. So I feel like that's kind of a very interesting phenomenon itself, but you have all of these data analysis things that kind of the field is still a little bit on the fence of. So on the one hand, like, it to be super interesting to kind of develop the theory to explain that, but then at the same time, like, you could spend 5-10 years working on that and then it all just kind of fizzle out because we realized that actually it was an artifact all along.
Yeah, I'll give you another practical perspective, and it's just a general rule of thumb that we tend to follow throughout our work. What we cannot reproduce with and without edge time series, we generally don't report. So for us all, or I'm sorry, not edge time series, but with and without a global signal regression, we generally don't report. The results that I presented today, especially the PNAS paper, our reviewers were very careful to ask us to do both. And what we report here, the phenomena that we've talked about, are very general and aren't profoundly impacted by this processing decision. I agree. There's still questions surrounding that, and it's something that somebody in that space who's much more interested in a global signal than I am will have to address.
Great, thank you. So I just once again want to congratulate Rick on this, his lab, on this wonderful work. I want to thank all of our speakers, Emma, Amy, Kaio, and Rick, for giving fantastic talks. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much to John and to Milad for shepherding us through this process today. And I invite you all to attend the closing remarks by Scott. That's all from me. Thank you all.
Thank you.